Okay. So this is the screen that you'll typically land on in OmniCenter when you log in. If you haven't set a custom dashboard, you'll land on what we call the Consolidated Dashboard. So from here, I can kind of navigate to all of the major functions within the tool. Some of the ones that we talked about just now, you can see the active incidents page, which will show you a list of all of the currently active incidents on the system. And our demo system here is designed to always have lots of incidents, so we have stuff to look at. From here, I can acknowledge these problems. So if I have stuff that I know is good that I'm working on, I can hit acknowledge. I can put in a reason for that acknowledgement. And then once that acknowledgement reason gets processed, it'll change the state of those incidents to acknowledge so I can see that they've been acknowledged. And if I drill into one of these incidents, you'll actually be able to see what I typed in as the acknowledgement reason, who I was logged in as at the time, how long it took to acknowledge the problem, and how long it's been since then. Now, one important concept in OmniCenter is that we also have a auto disable timer. So what the auto disable timer is designed to do is if something goes down in OmniCenter and it stays down for a really long time, OmniCenter will attempt basically to disable that device to stop monitoring it. So what it'll do is it'll put it into a state where instead of checking it every couple of minutes to see if it's up, if it's been down for longer than about a week by default, it'll put it in a state where it's only going to check it about once an hour, and it's going to disable any attempt to monitor the device other than that until the device recovers. This is just designed to save resources in the event you have devices that are down for a really long time. Generally speaking, if it's going to be down, more than a week, it's probably something that should be disabled in OmniCenter rather than just waiting for the alarm to show up. Very often we've seen customers who have devices that have been decommissioned and they just don't delete them. So this gives you a way to kind of efficiently find those devices and not waste a lot of resources on them. Now, within that incident view as well, if I've defined action groups that have permissions to be executed manually, I can do that here. So there's a manual actions button in the upper right, and then whichever groups that I have the permissions to get to will show up in this window, and I can execute those against the device. So if it's open a trouble ticket, and I can automatically acknowledge when I execute that if I want to, and I hit execute, it'll do whatever actions I've defined as part of that particular action group. So if I go in here to administration and go to alerts and go down to actions, this is where I define my action groups. And you can see here whether or not the groups are in use. If they are in use, you can click on the in use and it'll tell you exactly what they're applied to. So in this case, this contact group is set for these thresholds on these devices. It's set for these services on these devices. And it gives you an idea of exactly where that contact group is configured. Within each action group, I can define multiple different subgroups, and then every subgroup can have multiple actions with them. So those might be people, for example, who have email addresses or mobile notifications or SMS set up for them. It could be scripts, for example. So if I go in here, for example, my trouble ticket action, it's defined with a open trouble ticket definition that runs a webhook, and that webhook calls this particular URL with this particular payload, and it gives you that visibility into that particular incident. So whatever actions you define in that group will get executed. And you'll notice that within the action groups, there's also, some of them will have a little blue box here, and the blue box is for what level is allowed to manually execute this group. So when I edit a group, I can set a manual alert level, and any user of that level or higher will be able to manually execute that group. So if you want to give your help desk folks access to the device to, open trouble tickets or restart services, but not reboot servers, you can do that. And then your administrators, you can give them a button to reboot the server if you want to. The other important concept with action groups is you'll notice that there's a time frame tied to these. So these time frames are actually defined under administration alerts time frames, and you can define as many as you like. The ones that come by default are basically working hours, non-working hours, 24/7, and none. What these do is these are actually act as filters. So for example, in this case, if this group gets called, it's going to go to this contact and start executing these actions if it's valid for those particular hours. So in this case, the mobile notifications are valid 24/7. The SMS action is only valid for whatever I've defined as my any hours time frame. And then the email action is set for a time frame I've called APAC. So it's designed for a specific time zone in this case. Two important concepts with the time zones that are set on alerts. One is that if a contact has a time frame associated with it, any alerts that go out outside that time frame will never be sent to that contact method. So if that contact method, for example, is a PowerShell script and I have it set to only run after working hours, someone who tries to execute that action even during working hours will not be able to execute that PowerShell action. It will effectively limit what can be done there. And an example of why that might get used is we had one customer who set up their action groups in such a way that, during the day when their help desk is staffed, they would, notify the help desk when a service went down. But if it was after hours, what they would do is they would notify the on-call person and they would attempt to restart the service automatically. So they built the action group with the idea that you had after hours functions with that non-working hours time frame, and you had a during working hours time frame in the same group, so that it was intelligent enough to do whichever action was required by the time. And those time frames are all set in the context of the server's local time zone. So if you go to administration and you go to system and you go to diagnostics, you'll be able to see the time zone that the system is set to and change it if you need to. But this is the time zone for which all of those hours are being compared. So it's always in the server's local time zone.